In John chapter 9, there's a story about a man who was born blind, and yet Jesus heals him. Now, once this man has been healed, it causes quite a stir because his neighbors and people who've seen him from ever since he was a child and have known him to be blind are amazed at this miracle that's taken place. Um, and of course, then the Pharisees come in on it because this man, first of all, he's been healed on the Sabbath day, which they would have taken issue with. Um, but they launch into an investigation over this healing about this man and what they really want to do, because remember, the Pharisees were often at odds with Jesus. So what they really want to do is they want this man to um, to not come out in support of Jesus. They're trying to trap him or to get him to say something that would help their cause. But what happens is that this man says this in John chapter 9, verse 25. He says, um, I don't know how, I don't know if he's a sinner or not, because the Pharisees are trying to make it out that Jesus is a sinner. He's not the Son of God. But this man's response is, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. All I know is that I used to be blind, but now I can see. So this man says, I don't know, what you're talking about. All I know is that I used to be blind and now I see. So this man's response to Jesus is that Jesus has healed him. And his response to Jesus is that I used to be blind, but now I see. We all get to choose our response to Jesus, how we will respond to Jesus. Of course, the Pharisees, their response to Jesus is to be closed-minded. Their response to Jesus is to come against anything that Jesus would say. They're so closed-minded and they're in spiritual darkness that they cannot be glad for a man who's been blind all his life. I mean, a huge miracle has taken place, but they cannot respond to Jesus in a way that says, yes, you are Lord. But this man, he does eventually say that Jesus is Lord when Jesus comes back to him. But here I want you just to notice the man's response to Jesus is that all I know is that I was blind and now I see, because we know that Jesus came into the world. Part of his mission was to give sight to the blind. And when we talk of giving sight to the blind, it's sight in the physical sense. Of course, we see in this man, he healed him of blindness. But there's also the metaphorical side of it, where Jesus brings spiritual sight. So for those that could not see, which is all of us as sinners, before Christ ever touched us, before we ever received the Holy Spirit, we were dead in our transgressions. We lived in darkness because of sin. But Jesus coming into our lives, Jesus who is the light of the world, does for us what he does for this man in a spiritual sense. He takes us from, as this man says, all I know is that I used to be blind and now I see. And that's the beauty of having Christ in our lives. There's the wonderful song, Amazing Grace. How sweet that sound. Amazing Grace is a song that just really highlights that amazing grace of God. And it even has that line, I once was blind, but now I see. And for the believer that knows what it is to live life without ever having been touched by Christ, for the believer that knows what it is to live life having been touched by Christ, having been given that spiritual sight, their response is to say, just as this man says, he says Jesus is Lord, because when Jesus comes back to him, as we read further on, it says in verse 37, Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you, because he's just asked who he is." And he says, then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. We really see from this story what it is to respond to Christ, because only Christ can give us spiritual sight. Only Christ can open our eyes so that we can see things we never saw before. And so today, walk in the light of God, walk in his light. I love the verse John 8 verse 12, which says, I'm the light of the world. There's a wonderful Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world," but there's a wonderful promise there where he says, "Anyone who believes in me will never walk in darkness." Walk with Christ, you will never walk in darkness.